Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank you all for having me, and particularly Leslie, who set up this talk, and thank you all for coming. Why don't we start? I can actually maybe squeeze this on and run this myself. I'll do it. Okay. Well, let me give you some of the motivation behind today's presentation. I have a good friend by the name of Adam Warback. Adam Warback is sort of in the American environmental movement, something of a idiosyncratic figure. When he was 22, it was the first time ever that email was used for a campaign. He was a student at Brown University. He ran for president of Sierra Club and won at age 22. And he was a pretty radical environmentalist, and he still is. He's very, very green. Lives in San Francisco, and but about a year ago, a little more now, he came out with a book, or more was a speech that was turned into sort of a monograph called "Is Environmentalism Dead?" And this corresponded with another study that came out called "The Death of Environmentalism." And what these people argued basically was that environmentalism had failed in the U.S. and that environmentalists, if they cared about the environment, had to reassess and redefine themselves and basically start from scratch, and declared that the movement was dead. What were they arguing in this particular treatise? They said every significant indicator of global environmental health is heading in the wrong direction. So basically they said we're failing, and their explanation for that was too focused on technical policy fixes in the orientation of the major environmental organizations, and therefore they were incapable of addressing the real serious global challenge we have. And the reason, one of the other tactical things they said, it was too negative, that they lacked this ability to put forward a positive ideology which would embrace the real issues and capture the imagination of citizens around the world. And it was a very, very discouraging piece of work and writing. And when Adam sent me a copy of it, I was really annoyed at him because he sent it to me about 11:30 at night. It happened to arrive while I was working on my email. So I read the thing and couldn't help myself and stayed up till 3:30 in the morning writing him back a very angry rebuttal, because I think he got it wrong. So today's talk, besides being a sort of a promotional talk for a book that I wrote, is also in a sense an attempt to give an answer, because I think that only well-meaning but somewhat out of touch and arrogant American environmentalists could have come up with this kind of a notion that environmentalism is dead. And as somebody who is something of an American expatriate, in other words, I grew up here in North Carolina, but I've been living abroad pretty much since I was 19 after I finished University of North Carolina, and spent a bit of time in the UN and worked on issues there, and United Nations and treaties on desertification absorbs a lot of my time. I think that he got it wrong. Fundamentally, that his perspective is not a global one. I'd like to share that with you. I think particularly you all, at as epicenter of environmental policy like this school is, you need to have that kind of perspective. So I'm going to do that by talking about modern environmentalism. Now, what is modern environmentalism? Well, there's a lot of different possible dates that are putting on the birth of modern environmentalism. Once a very effective BBC documentary that stated it was at the Minamoto episode in Japan, if you're familiar with that particular crisis, where a whole fishing village and communities were decimated by mercury poisoning that happened in the early 50s. There's a lot of dates, but I think most folks like to give the credit to Rachel Carson, and I assume at this school they make you read a little bit of her work. If they don't, then shame on them. But Rachel Carson, who really blew the whistle on pesticides when she came out with Silent Spring in 1962. And so I want to sort of take it through that period up until really right up to the present, and that's how I would define modern environmentalism. And when we talk about environmentalism, you could define it through a lot of things, issues, and we could define it with regard to organizations. But personally, I have a great belief that when you look at the stories of individual countries and where progress was actually made, has a lot to do with people. And the great anthropologist Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I think that is never more true in the environmental movement than another one. You can go all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt and the conservation movement here if you want examples of that. Certainly, there are events that have made a difference, but I think it's people who brought a particular message. And I give this picture because I think this is the first time in the U.S. where we had this many people listening to great environmental speeches, which is the theme of this particular talk. Now, how did I get this idea to write a book like this? I had this peculiar status in Johannesburg. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but every 10 years, the leaders of the world get together to talk about the state of the planet. In 1972, they started in Stockholm. 82, they were in Nairobi. 92, of course, Rio de Janeiro. And then 2002, the World Summit for Sustainable Development. And the UN advised government government delegations to include a non-government representative. So I had this very, very enviable status in the Israeli government's delegation. On the one hand, I had all the benefits of being with the 10,000 people who were in the government forum, and we stayed in nice hotels, got drove around, all kinds of nice meals. All my colleagues that were non-governments, there was about 70,000 NGOs there, and we sent over about 20 people from Israel, and they were all sleeping in sleeping bags on floors and toughing it out, but I was living the high life with the government folks. But on the other hand, I didn't have any bosses. They were all stuck in all kinds of meetings, and I just wandered around, did whatever I wanted. So I was looking for a way to meet all these amazing people, because you wandered around 190 countries there, representatives from all their environmental organizations and agencies. So I decided to use this as my icebreaker. I would come up to somebody and say, hey, what would you say is the greatest environmental speech in your country's history? My name's Alon, and I'm sort of curious about this. And most people looked like me, like I was deaf, and sort of walked away. But there were a few things. That's an interesting question. Like I came up to one woman. It was the session there, and she was sitting at the Tanzanian. It's all like the UN. So I came over to her. There was a break, and I said, "No, it was the greatest speech in Tanzanian history." And she said, "For that, you'd have to ask the Minister of Environment." I said, where is he? She said, no, I'm the Minister of Environment. But I'll take some thinking that here's my email. And she said, write me, and I wrote her. She hasn't written me back yet, so I'm still waiting for her answer. But I did get a lot of answers. Some of them, I remember I met 3 different people in Vietnam, and they all agreed that the greatest environmental speech there was Ho Chi Minh's speech in the middle of the Indochina Wars, where he declared a day, an Arbor Day for the trees, a birthday for the trees, and it was a really big deal. And in fact, when I was on sabbatical in New Zealand, the ambassador from Vietnam managed to track this thing down and personally translate it. And it was horribly boring. So I left it out of the book I was writing, but that's how it went through trial and error. So I started collecting these things, and I'd actually written a grant to go and write this great book of environmental speeches, and I thought it would be a great fun thing to do, to go around and do all this sleuthing in countries and save these speeches from the dustbins of history. And I wrote to 20 people, sure, this brilliant idea would get well funded, and of course it was rejected time and again and again. So in the end, I just went to New Zealand, and I had to put my faith in virtual, generosity and personal assistance, and I got incredible response at the edge of the world and managed to get my hands on just about every environmental speech you can imagine. And so I sifted through it, so I called it a virtual triumph, and I came up with this book. So that's what I'll be talking about today in my rebuttal to my friends. Now, why would you want to study environmental speeches if you want to understand the environmental message of the world and where we're at? So the first thing is you have to remember that I think the majority of people are not necessarily literate in this planet. And those who can don't necessarily like to read or prefer certainly to keep away from the fascinating environmental tomes that you guys are all suffering with as environmental studies students. So, but I think speeches always have the ability to reach out and touch people's heart, to transcend barriers. And so that was one of the reasons I thought this would give us a more authentic message, sort of without all the academic footnotes that sometimes really cloud the message. So the next thing I had to do is figure out what a speech was, because you could do a lot of things, and you see a lot of different definitions in literature, but my favorite one was a projected conversation. In other words, this is a little bit different than a lecture. When you hear a speech, it's somebody who's probably talking more in the vernacular and really trying to engage the audience in a talk, even though the audience may not be responding to them, but as if they were dealing with that. Now, the selection for criteria for what are the great speeches that can represent modern environmentalism. Well, first of all, I wanted speeches that made a difference. If I could find a speech that actually changed the way people looked at an issue or history, that was important. I also wanted to focus on people who'd made a difference and who'd really changed the environmental scene in their countries or on the world stage. And of course, I wanted to capture a broad array of the richness of the environmental messages throughout history and different impulses. So I have a lot of different people. Maybe, I don't know if you can see this. Perhaps I should cut the lights up front here. All right. So going from right to left, maybe, or left to right for you all, I don't know if we'll do a sort of an environmental trivia test. The woman on the left, I think, is acknowledged as India's greatest environmental advocate, at least these days. That's Vandana Shiva. She's very, very articulate, brilliant physicist who is probably the most outspoken opponent of genetically modified seeds and big enemy of globalization. Got a speech from her. The man next to him is Chico Mendes, who's sort of the martyr of the rainforest, was the man who really organized the rubber tappers into the first real serious reserves in the Amazon. I'm sure you all recognize our own, everybody's favorite, but much bedraggled Prince of Wales, who's often considered a little bit nutty by his countrymen because he is such a strong advocate for organic agriculture. The woman over here is quite a hero. I hope maybe you've heard of Lois Gibbs. Does that resonate with any of you? Ever heard of Love Canal? Little town in Buffalo, near Buffalo, where they discovered a huge amount of toxic waste, and she was this, housewife who'd only been to high school, and this fact that her kid got so sick turned her into an environmental warrior, and eventually took EPA officials as hostages until they got what they wanted from the Jimmy Carter administration. She now runs a wonderful environmental organization in Washington. Ken Saro-Wiwa is next to her. He's sort of considered a martyr from Nigeria. He fought very hard to get Shell Oil to stop destroying his ancestral homelands, and was killed by his government for doing it. And the woman on the far right, I don't know if anybody's familiar with Petra Kelly, but she's acknowledged maybe as the grandmother of the Green Party in Germany, and was murdered by her boyfriend. A horrible incident, but a brilliant woman. Anyway, these are some of the characters that appear in the book, and I'm not going to talk about any of them today. But that each one brings a very different perspective. Now, when you want to pick out a good speech, what are you going to do? Well, you look at a lot of people, but maybe when we think about American culture, who had more concern about what a good speech was than any other president, certainly more than the present one, was Ronald Reagan. So these were his axioms for a great environmental speech. Never talk longer than 20 minutes. Keep your argument just as essentials. Don't ramble. Start with a joke. Well, these are really important guidelines, but the thing is, I sifted through dozens of environmental speeches, and not one of them conformed to a single one of Ronald Reagan's rules of speech making. I mean, they all went on and on and on with these incredible, monotonous details, and people just get on these tangents because it's so interesting. You have to listen to this. And environmentalists are humorless. The joke: how many environmentalists does it take to change a light bulb? That's not funny. Anyway, so the truth of the matter is that despite the fact that these speeches ostensibly were failures by Ronald Reagan's rules of speech making, I thought them incredibly compelling speeches, and the reason has something to do with what Winston Churchill, maybe the greatest orator of the 20th century for sure, had to say. He said, "Believing what you're talking about is the key to great public speaking." And all these people, with all these great environmentalists, with all the passion they put in these speeches, somehow it works, and it does resonate, and it makes a big difference. So I felt it was a worthwhile thing to collect some of these speeches from 20 different environmental heroes. And I guess when I went back and started looking at the real reason I decided to put this book had something to do with the speech I heard in 1994 from David Brower. Now I'm going to do sort of a survey here. Who here has heard of David Brower before they came to the room today? Okay, well, that's good on you, because David Brower is largely recognized as the greatest American conservationist ever. He took a little hiking club in San Francisco and turned it into the great powerhouse that the Sierra Club is today, and broke all the rules, and lost his tax-exempt status, and pissed everybody off in his own organization. They ended up firing him. He went off and founded Friends of the Earth. They fired him there. He set up Earth Island Institute, but he was an incredible man. And he used to start all his speeches with the same, what he called a sermon, okay? And basically it went something like this. If you took the Earth and you condensed the 4 billion years of geologic history we know to basically a 6-day week of creation, okay, that we think about in the book of Genesis, okay? So the first 2-3 days, it's a lot of gases and chaos and not much going on. Around the third day in the morning, you start getting a little bit of oxygen build up, and the chlorophyll and life storms start appearing. And that starts to expand, and life expands until maybe someday on the sixth day in the afternoon, the dinosaurs appear around 2 in the afternoon in this week of history. And they were there for 5 hours, 7 in the afternoon. They disappear, but they had 5 hours. They compared to us, pretty good. And then we run it forward, 2 minutes before midnight, something resembling human beings appear. And then like 2 seconds before midnight, we get modern agriculture. A second before midnight, we're talking about, Jesus Christ walks on water in the Holy Land. And then at about a 50th of a second before midnight, we get the industrial age. And then here we are at midnight. And basically he says, there's some people who think that we can continue to treat the earth like we have in this, brief 50th of a second before midnight. And those people are serious people. They're world leaders and heads of corporations and the like, but I'm telling you, they're absolutely mad. And that's how he would start all speeches. And it went on to use a lot of other fascinating metaphors. And I know I walked out of there fired up to go out and do more to save the earth. And so I felt, somebody's got to say that kind of speech for posterity. So that really is one of the things that got me going. And I'm going to talk about today about 5 different kind of heroes, go in a little more depth before we open discussion. People that I thought made great speeches, just to give you a sense of the broad variety of them. Rachel Carson, just because she got it all started, and she's just, I wanted to call my daughter Rachel, except my wife's name is Rachel, so she wouldn't let me. But I guess I married her. Then Yitzhak Smolansky, well, I'm from Israel, and he was the Israeli that I put in the book, and I think he gave a great speech. Margaret Thatcher. Now, some of you who follow British politics may wonder, how did Margaret Thatcher get into an environmental anthology? I mean, she's often considered sort of like, the Voldemort of the environmental world, Darth Vader or something. I mean, she, was the one, if anybody saw the movie Billy Elliot, that was her who broke the backs of the coal miners and, was in favor of nuclear power. But keep an open mind, and maybe by the end of the talk you'll understand how she got in. The Dalai Lama was just, I think, is an inspiration for many people who are interested in Eastern thought and religion and just in general, a great world leader. And then Wang Gary Maathai's the most recent speech. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004, the first environmentalist ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And so these are the 5 people I'm going to talk about for the next 20 minutes or so. So let's talk about Rachel Carson, just a real brief background. DDT more or less comes on the stage in 1948 as a commercial commodity. Paul Muller, who invents it, a Swiss chemist, wins the Nobel Prize for it. It's an amazing invention, really cheap to make, really effective, can stop malaria in its tracks, and the massive spraying begins. Now, it was very, very unlikely that Rachel Carson would be the zealot who stood up to that particular invention. She was born in 1907 in a fairly rural area of Pennsylvania. She grew up in an age where basically women had to make a choice. They could be serious professionals or they could have a family. And I guess she ended up just making the former choice. Now, she had to quit her PhD studies at Johns Hopkins in oceanography because with the Depression, and she had to make money for her family. She took a job writing radio scripts for the Fish and Wildlife Agency in Washington, and it gave her, eventually she became sort of a staff writer for those guys, but it gave her huge access to a lot of material. In 1951, she published a book called The Sea Around Us, which is still a marvelous book if you want to understand the oceans. It's, they always see sort of like a scientist, but he was also a psalmist in one. It's a great, great book if you ever have time to want a great read. And it was a bestseller, and she wrote another bestseller about nature and the oceans, and it kind of gave her time that she could quit her government job and do what she liked. And she was a pack rat. She used to keep all these reports. It was before the age of the internet, of course, and so she would get all these reports about pesticides, and then she decided to take a couple years and figure out what it all meant. So in September 27th, 1962, Silent Spring comes out, first as a series of articles in the New Yorker, which over the years has done a lot of interesting things environmentally, and then as a book. Now, in terms of sales, I mean, this is the environmental Harry Potter. Can you imagine, in those days, 100,000 copies in 1 week of an environmental book, which today, even now, is a little bit turgid and tough to get through. It did not make her popular amongst the chemical industry, because basically they felt that she'd taken a direct shot at them, and so they, of course, went on to all these ad hominem attacks, calling her a communist or a peace nut. My favorite is, isn't it just like a woman to be scared of a few little bugs? Which is such an ironic critique, because she was saying you don't have to be afraid of a few insects. You don't have to spray automatically. But she held her ground, and eventually even President Kennedy claims to have read the book, and it made a huge difference, and we started getting modern environmental legislation. Now, the speech I'm going to share with you, just a real brief section of it, was given in the Garden Club of America in January 1963. This is less than a year before she dies of cancer. And she died of breast cancer and was already not well, but she had already suffered a big counterattack by the chemical industries, and she reorganized and came charging back. And it was very important for her that environmentalists reach out to natural partners and constituencies. I think that's something the world environmental movement can learn from, because we tend to be sometimes cloistered among ourselves and don't find the partners we might amongst labor or whatever. In her case, she felt the gardeners. People are out there spraying. They need to know what's going on. And so she decided to reach out to them and gave this speech. And I'll just give you just a paragraph or two, because I think it's important to share. And she said, "It's my conviction that if we automatically call in the spray planes or reach for the aerosol bomb when we have an insect problem, we are resorting to crude methods of a rather low scientific order. We are being particularly unscientific when we fail to press forward with research that will give us the kind of weapons we need. Some such weapons now exist, brilliant and imaginary prototypes of what I trust will be the insect control methods of the future. I criticize the present heavy reliance upon biocides on several grounds. First, on the grounds of their inefficiency. I have here some comparative figures on the toll taken of our crops by insects before and after DDT, and going on, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what she made that talk, and really managed to successfully convince the Congress. She testified there a couple times. John Lindsay, later became mayor of New York, was the one who hosted her. And I think that speech, when her biographer, Linda Lear, described the speech, it was really the first time when she decided she was going to come fighting back. And it has a lot of themes. She calls in there for there to be much more citizen organization, of course. The Environmental Defense Fund, now Environmental Defense, one of the big organizations, rallied around this issue and made a difference. So that's one issue. Sort of when it all got started, when things were very, very different, and the kind of the things she's saying now are things that we are very, very clear to us. But basically, it's inappropriate to say that she was against pesticides. She just was in favor of a little bit of common sense in using them. So we should be different promoters, chiefly in the means we advocate rather than the ends to be attained. Now, I'd like to say a little bit about Yishar Smolansky, who actually has pen name in Hebrew as S. Yishar. He was of that generation of Israelis who had a pretty good life, and he already published his first book at age 22. But 10 years later, he had to quit his graduate studies at Hebrew University to take part in the War of Independence when Israel was attacked by 7 different countries when it declared its independence. And that experience really shaped his way of looking at the world. His books are full of the angst of soldiers and the horrible dilemmas they face as they come up against citizen populations. But the other themes in his books is the natural world that he describes so poetically. But it wasn't enough for him to be a author, and he decided he'd tie his hand in politics, and for 5 terms sat in our Knesset. He was really the first member of Knesset who was a green politician. And when there was a major battle over whether or not there should be nature reserves in Israel, it was his voice that really made a difference. I'll kind of sketch out that situation. What happened in the 1950s after the Holocaust, really almost 2 million people came to Israel, tripled the population of the country, and lots of construction happened very, very quickly. The country became dotted with all these new cities, and the question was, would be there a place for nature? And there was no law that said there would be. Now, the Prime Minister's office at the time realized that they should protect something, but they were more into the archaeological scene. Figured there was a lot of historical treasures, and for them, a nature reserve, which would be maybe a few patches of grass, a swimming pool, and an entrance fee as you come in. And the environmental movement at the time said there was a small group of nature lovers who said, no, we want to get Yosemite. That's the model, or Serengeti, or one of these big kind of game parks. And so the battle was the stage was set for a major battle in our Knesset, in our parliament, and that was really the debate that was going on. And in terms of finding an advocate for them, we had I won't get into all the details of the politics, but what happened was that the prime minister at the time was the man on the left, David Ben-Gurion, has hired George Washington. He was the one promoting, his office was the one promoting the very narrow sort of archaeological parks kind of view, and he made a speech about it. And at that point, Smolansky got up and gave a speech which literally changed the course of our country's natural history. And for those people who care about the Holy Land and preserving treasures for future generations, I think it has universal significance. So this is just a brief excerpt from that speech as well. Just get it here. Okay. Before we can beautify this or that corner of the countryside, the landscape is wasted. Before we can offer an opinion, someone has already stretched out his hand, taken and developed a particular region, developed and destroyed it. Need I add that for humans it is impossible to live without some open vistas that have not been transformed by the hand of man. It is impossible to exist in a place where everything is organized and planned to last detail, until all remnants of the original image, the natural and organic signs of the earth creation, are erased. It is a necessity for a man to have a place to go to shake himself off and refresh himself from the city, from the constructed, from the enclosed, from the delivered. And it is essential to soak up the refreshing connection with the primal, with the exposed, with the coming, before the coming of man. A land where the breeze blows without wildflowers is a place of suffocation. A land where winds cannot blow unobstructed will be a hotel, not a homeland. A land that is all roads and sidewalks and a sense of ultimate construction will devour all good portions in the hearts of its young people. And that speech was so potent that the Prime Minister listening there got up afterwards and said, I'm convinced. And he changed the law, his proposal. And in the end, we have a nature system that protects 25% of the real estate in Israel. So pretty good job for one speech. And so we talk about what one speech can do, can make a difference. Now, I promised you an explanation for Margaret Thatcher. So just for those of you who aren't familiar with her biography, Margaret Thatcher is often, heralded as this incredible British success story, the daughter of a grocer who made it to the top. He was a grocer, her father, but he was also mayor of the town, so it wasn't such humble origins. But she grew up and went on to university during World War II. She was at Oxford, studied chemistry, and that's important as the story unfolds of her. And she was, in 1943, became the first female president of the Oxford University Conservative Association. I guess that'd be like the Young Republicans on campus here or something. And in 1950, she ran right after for Parliament, failed. She got married, had a kid. In 59, she runs again. This time she succeeds and takes a Tory seat there. In 61, even only she was 2 years in the job, she was picked out to be a junior minister. And then she was the Minister of Pensions and immediately gained some notoriety because she canceled all the subsidies on the children's lunch for the poor children. And people called her Thatcher the milk snatcher. But she didn't care. And when Edward Heath stumbled and was beaten by the Labour Party, she quickly went in for the kill, and in 74 was elected head of the Conservative Party. Remember, I was studying political science at Carolina in 79 when she was elected, and people didn't know what quite to make of her. And she was not an ordinary prime minister. First of all, we remember her because she was tough. She was a take no prisoners kind of capitalist. Remember, that was a big, big welfare state that she had to dissemble. So she had high interest rates to keep inflation intact. When Argentina went to the Falkland Islands, she sent the British Army in, didn't start apologizing to Tony Blair, just went in there, conquered it, and refused to negotiate with the IRA. So she was the Iron Woman, is what people called her, and she had the record from Tony Blair of most years of office. Environmentally, no great shakes there. She was always pro-nuclear. She was very, very unwelcome to the rise of EU regulation, which began at that time, and all the directives coming out of Brussels, and basically felt disengaged. She had a Minister of Environment and felt that it wasn't the Prime Minister's position to get involved in the environment. So the question is, what is she doing in environmental anthology? Well, the thing about it was, like I said, she was a chemist. In 1985, there was this incredible discovery that the ozone layer was depleting. And the people who discovered that was British scientists down in Antarctica. And her science advisor came and briefed her on it, and she kind of listened to that. So in 89, she was very dissatisfied. This has been after the Montreal Protocol, presumably, was making a solution. She said, that's no solution. Too slow, too little, too late. Let's phase them out. Get rid of all the CFCs and save the ozone layer. So she had all the nations of the world come to London. She hosted this conference, and she browbeated George Bush, the father, who was the president at the time, and said, you got to come here and get with the program, America. Nothing that Tony Blair has managed to do with the sun. And they indeed phased out ozone in a very, very expeditious timetable, and they created for the first time a fund that would assist developing countries and allow them to also phase out. And then at that point, the first signs were coming in that the planet was getting warming. Remember, this is in the late 80s, okay? This is right not long after people like Carl Sagan said there was going to be the world was getting colder, okay? So there wasn't a lot of clear, but she saw the signs and she was convinced. And every year the major heads of states are invited to give talks at the United Nations. Every year she'd come and she'd talk about communism, this and that. Her last talk at the United Nations, she talked about the environment. And this is a speech that she gave in, really was her swan song at the UN, because thereafter her own party foolishly threw her out, and they were out of power very soon after that, after power. But she made this speech, and I'd like to share a bit of it, what she had to say then, way back in 1989, about climate change, even then. While the conventional political dangers, the threat of global annihilation, the fact of regional war appear to be receding, we have all recently become aware of another insidious danger. It is as menacing in its way as those more accustomed perils with which international diplomacy has concerned itself for centuries. It is the prospect of irretrievable damage to the atmosphere, to the oceans, to Earth itself. Of course, major changes in the Earth's climate and the environment have taken place in earlier centuries when the world's population was a fraction of its present size. The causes are to be found in nature itself. Changes in the Earth's orbit, changes in the amount of radiation given by the sun, the consequential effects on the plankton, the ocean, and volcanic processes. All these we can observe, and some we may be able to predict. But we do not have the power to prevent and control them. What we are doing now to the world by degrading the land surfaces, by polluting the waters, and by adding greenhouse gases to the air at an unprecedented rate, all this is new in the experience of the Earth. It is mankind and his activities which are changing the environment of our planet in damaging and dangerous ways. And she goes on to go down and call for a treaty. And indeed, in 1992, we get a global framework, a world framework for climate change, which in 97 produces the Kyoto Accords. And so it's quite amazing. She didn't have to go see it, even a inconvenient truth, to be convinced as early as 1989 there was a problem, and speak out and say this is a real issue and we have to deal with it. And think how different the world would be if in 1989 they had really let Margaret Thatcher lead the way and we'd gotten on with global warming issues then. We might have a hydrogen economy, we could do a lot of things. And so she really was a prophet in this issue. But thanks to her, Margaret Thatcher, the right-wing, reactionary, was going to talk climate change. All of a sudden, this was an issue that other world leaders felt they could deal with, and that's why we got the treaty. So we owe her a lot with that. I want to talk a bit about the Dalai Lama. Now, the Dalai Lama, for those of you who are not Brad Pitt fans and have seen his version of it, he was born in a little village in Tibet, and of course, according to the Tibetan Buddhist theology, the Dalai Lama dies and the soul transmigrates to another child, and he had this incredible ability, uncanny, in the sort of the equivalent of a criminal lineup. They lay down 6 different items in front of him, one of them belonging to the previous Dalai Lama, and this 3-year-old kid could every time point to that particular item, which had been the previous Dalai Lamas, with a whole variety of them. They say, that's it, we've got the real thing, and they whisked him off to the capital, and they gave him a very, very intensive training in the rudiments and then advanced precepts of Tibetan Buddhist theology. And in 1950, he took over at the age of 15. And remember, he's not just the religious leader, but also the political leader of Tibet. Of course, the timing was tumultuous. That was just after the communists had taken over, and this forgotten province, way out in the west, all of a sudden became a target for communist invasion and domination. In 1954, he travels to Beijing to negotiate with Mao Zedong unsuccessfully. And in 1959, the fairly passive and very non-violent Tibetans could take no more, and they put on this sort of pitiful revolt with their World War I rifles and were slaughtered by the Communist Red Army. In 1960, his followers were convinced he was going to be killed, and they whisked him away to India, where he's been in exile ever since. Although his people have suffered greatly, he never espoused violence, but continues to espouse peace. And in 1989, he was given the Nobel Peace Prize because of his message. Now, I'm a professor at Gurion University, so I was delighted when we honored him as well this year, and he came and talked to us. Now, remember that the Tibetan environmental experience is somewhat unique, and some of the response to people had a lot to do with the theology of the Buddhist creed that they espouse. Remember that the way the Dalai Lama sees it, the goal actually of all religions is compassion. And that expands beyond humans but to the natural world as well. So, of course, vegetarianism, there's a ban on fishing and hunting, have always been there. And one of the things I most admire about him, and he talks, I've read a lot of his speeches about the environment, and he says, the real solution to the world's population problem is for everybody to become a Tibetan monk. But short of that, people have to get with family planning, and I think that's very important to have the spiritual leader and head of a world religion actively promoting family planning and birth control. I think that makes him somewhat unique on the world stage, and others could take a lesson from that. Of course, the sort of pristine environmental harmony which characterized Tibet was severely ruptured with the communist invasion, where they started tearing down the trees, using this as nuclear dumping grounds, mining without any concern for their environmental ramifications, and hunting basically a mess. And this is something which he raises in his speeches. But when he came to talk at the Earth Summit, that's one of those gatherings of world leaders, and he was honored there, he decided not to make this a China bashing event. He felt that that was not the message that he needed to make. And he gave a talk about what he called universal responsibilities. So I'd like to read you a little bit from the Dalai Lama and how he perceives the environment. I'll just give you the last few lines of his speech. I'd like to conclude by stating that in general I feel optimistic about the future. The rapid changes in our attitude toward the earth are also a source of hope. As recently as a decade ago, we thoughtlessly devoured the resources of the world as if there were no end to them. We failed to realize that unchecked consumerism was disastrous for both the environment and social welfare. Now individuals and governments are seeking a new ecological and economic order. I love this part. I often joke that the moon and the stars look beautiful, but if any of us tried to live on them, we would be miserable. This blue planet of ours is a delightful habitat. Its life is our life. Its future, our future. Indeed, the earth acts like a mother to all of us. Like children, we are dependent on it. In the face of such global problems as the greenhouse effect and the depletion of the ozone layer, individual organizations and single nations are helpless. Unless we all work together, no solution can be found. Our Mother Earth is teaching us a lesson in universal responsibility. So that's a message from Tibet we can all learn from. And from our last speaker, I'd like to mention Wangari Maathai, a remarkable woman, and I had the privilege of meeting her about 8 months ago in Nairobi. She was one of those stars that was so brilliant that even the colonial government, the British colonial government in Kenya, recognized her and picked her out and sent her off to a special girls' school. And then she got scholarships and managed to do a PhD in the U.S., the first African woman, black African woman to receive a PhD, and go back and was the first department head in an African university. And she was really quite successful, but she was not happy to stay in the ivory tower. And she recognized that the situation of the Kenyan women was unacceptable and became very, very active in the feminist movement there in the 1970s. That led her to begin to advocate tree planting, which she called ecological empowerment for women. She noticed that women were walking incredibly long distances to get firewood because they needed to heat the food. If they couldn't cook the food, that's why the children were becoming because having the malnutrition. But all the trees had been deforested and the desertification was setting in. So she started getting women involved in tree planting in the villages and set up hundreds of nurseries in this green belt movement, which was very, very successful. And so 30 million trees have been planted to date, and I went to visit the green belt offices in Nairobi, and it's really amazing. It's as grassroots as you can get, and they've got all these people out there planting trees and trying to reverse the horrible desertification. And then she went on to start dealing with other issues of political justice and began to challenge the ruling party. The Uhuru Park is their central park in Nairobi, and it's so critical because that city has so many problems. And it's quite a nice place. I jogged around it when I was there. My hotel was across the street. And that did not make the ruling party happy. She said the people need food. They don't need a skyscraper to house the ruling party. And so her life became much more difficult as a result of that. The president of Kenya at the time called her a mad woman, and she was arrested, beaten senseless twice. Her offices were closed, but she didn't blink. In fact, she even went on in 1992 to challenge him for president. She didn't exceed, but in 2002, when there finally were democratic elections, she was elected to parliament, and now she is the deputy minister of the environment. So there is sort of a happy ending to her story, and she, a few years later, was recognized by the Nobel Committee as a Nobel Peace Laureate. And I'm going to read you just a brief section from her speech, where she talks a lot about why she set up the Green Movement and how important it is. She said, "As I conclude, I reflect on my childhood experience when I would visit a stream next to our home to fetch water for my mother. I would drink water straight from the stream. Playing among the arrowroot leaves, I tried in vain to pick up the strands of frogs' eggs, believing they were beads. But every time I put my little finger under them, they would break. Later I saw thousands of tadpoles, black, energetic, and wriggling through the clear water against the background of the brown earth. This is the world I inherited from my parents. Today, over 50 years later, the streams have dried up, women walk long distances for water, which is not always clean, and children will never know what they have lost. The challenge is to restore the home of the tadpole and give back to our children a world of beauty and wonder. So those are just 5 examples of environmental heroes who have made real differences. And I would argue that their message is one which is as strong today as any other around the world. If you go to places like Finland, you find that 20% of the people are voting for Green parties, okay? And they're starting to get the message. And I think that it's inappropriate to assess the well-being of the world's environmental movement on the basis of the last 6 years in the United States, which have not necessarily been the best ones for the U.S. environmental movement. But also, I would think that to a certain extent, even here, the situation may not be quite as grave as some of the Green advocates might think. I mean, to a certain extent, the bad luck of the last 6 years had to do with the fact that McCain, lost 1 or 2 primaries by 20 or 30,000 votes, and then we could have had a whole different environmental policy and a whole different reality, or maybe Ralph Nader wouldn't have run, and we would have had Al Gore. So I don't think that we could say that just on the basis of a particular administration, which has never been pro-environmental, that we can declare environmentalism a failure. On the contrary, I would argue that American environmentalism has gone out and is one of the great contributions, much more important than what Hollywood has given to the world. Environmentalism has brought a common denominator across the planet, and these messages, which I hope are compelling to everybody on the planet, really are universal. And so, in summing up, first of all, in the great Israeli tradition of shameless self-promotion, I'd say that I have copies of Speaking of Earth. If any of you want to buy a book, they're bargain at $20. But more importantly, I would urge you, as you go on in your environmental careers, to reach out to the world. Some parts of the world are in dire need of American technology experience. And even though much of us now look to Europe for leadership, I think that's going to change very, very soon. And it's very important that this country reclaim its status as the leader of the world's global environmental movement. So that's my spiel, and I hope that I've said enough to engage you for some discussion. Thank you very much.